Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Tudor Talk. I'm going to be shortly welcoming our very special guest today, and that's journalist and author Sarah Gristwood. But before we go there, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah, and I'm the Tudor Travel Guide, and I run the Tudor Travel Guide blog, which is your visitor's companion to the houses and castles and manors of the 16th century. So I'm delighted to see already there's loads of people here. So normally I'm saying, do say hello, give me a thumbs up or give me a heart to let you know you're here, but I can see you're here. So while we just give everybody a chance to join, let's just see who's come on. And of course, at any time, just say hello in the chat. Let me know where you are in the world, what you've been up to today, and maybe what books you've read of Sarah's. And of course, once we get into the chat with Sarah, of course, please do drop your questions into the chat. And we're going to be talking for about an hour. So I'm going to try and ask as many of your questions as possible. Okay, so who do we have? We've got Linda. Hi, Linda, a new member of the Tudor Travel Guide channel. So that's fantastic. Welcome and thank you very much for supporting my work. For those of you who don't know, I do have a membership of this channel, and there is a join button on the homepage if you wanted to support what we do here. Okay, so welcome, Linda, and let me know where you are in the world. Oh, I see you're in Virginia and wondering when you'll get to the UK again. Well, I think that's a question on many people's lips at the moment. So Sue, hello, Sue, an old friend of the Tudor Travel Guide. Hi, everyone. I've got a nice cup of English breakfast tea. Good for you. I like that very much. And we've got Linda, who's in Carmel, California. That sounds lovely. And let's see, we've got also Nancy. Hi, Nancy, from north of New York City. Wow. Hi. Of course, you guys in the US
any of these are my friends from.
So there's Sarah in the background. She can hear me talking. So I know she knows there's a few of you coming online. So she's ready to welcome you and say hello. So that's great. So you guys over in the US have a very exciting time at the moment. Everything's on a knife edge, isn't it? And let's see how that goes. So we've got Barb from Nova Scotia, Canada. Hello. And Nina. Hello, Nina. Lovely to see you here. And Catherine. Oh gosh, lots and lots of people. Anna and Gillian and James, Wendy, Trina. Oh my goodness, there's so many of you here. It's lovely to see you here. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got Barb's just saying loved girl in the mirror. Okay. Okay,
Good.
so good. Right, okay, well, there's lots of you here, so I think we need to just kind of get straight on. So I want to introduce our guest. So let me just give her a little introduction, maybe for those of you who don't know Sarah. I can't believe any of you don't know Sarah, but anyway, here we go. This is the formal intro, folks. So you probably know Sarah. She's a Tudor biographer, novelist, broadcaster, former film journalist and a commentator on many royal affairs. I often see her on the BBC here in the UK when there's something going on in royal circles. Sarah graduated from Oxford University. She began working as a journalist, specialising in film interviews, and interviewed the likes of people like Robert De Niro and Paul McCartney. And she has written for most of the UK's leading newspapers and now writes regularly for the Huffington Post. But as far as Tudor history is concerned, folks, as you will know, Sarah is an author of fiction and non-fiction. She has 2 best-selling Tudor biographies, Arbella, England's Last Queen, and Elizabeth and Leicester. And then her non-fiction books, we have Blood Sisters, The Women Behind the Wars of the Roses, published in 2012, and most recently Game of Queens, The Women Who Made 16th Century Europe. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. So let me now welcome Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Tudor Talk.
Hello.
So you've got a lot of people here today waiting to join in the chat with you. And what I'm going to do, folks, is I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat. But I've got a few questions for Sarah that I'm hoping can kind of get the ball rolling, and then as questions come in, as I say, I'll try and ask as many as possible. Okay, good. So, Sarah, look, I really want to know, how did you get into Tudor history? A fellow Tudor lover, what's your story?
Well, I think it's to do with the place from which I'm talking to you. I was born in Kent, in England. I'm still in Kent here in my study. But Kent, if you live between Dover and Canterbury, you almost can't avoid the history.
Yeah.
I mean, you go into Canterbury, you meet a friend, you say, I'll meet you by the tomb of the Black Prince.
Is that
It leaves a mark, really, doesn't it?
yeah,
You know, I grew up visiting National Trust and other houses, and including your favourite, I know, Hever Castle.
yes, indeed.
And really, there you are. They've got you. Like the Jesuits said, you know, get a child before he's 8 years old, and he's yours for life. And that was it, I guess, with the Tudors, with history and me.
So you've been swept off your feet by those Tudor places, and there is nothing like
Yeah.
visiting a place, is there, to bring the history to life?
No, that's absolutely right. I still feel that. I've suffered in a way because some of my later books, once I started off on such an easy wicket with Arbella, who's utterly associated with one place in particular,
Mm.
Hardwick Hall in
Mhm.
Derbyshire. And then, you know, Elizabeth and Leicester, Kenilworth, Hatfield House,
Yes.
the Tower.
Yeah.
But when you start getting a little bit more diverse or a little bit further back in the past, that kind of physical research gets actually a lot harder. And I find that quite difficult when I
Mm.
can't go there and smell the roses.
Yeah. It makes all the difference in
Yeah,
the world.
it
It
does.
really
It totally
does.
does. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So, okay, so now in terms of writing,
Hmm.
I really like to understand kind of what motivates writers. We talked a little bit about your
Hmm.
love of Tudor
Yeah.
history, but is there a common theme that tends to inspire your
Yeah.
writing?
Yes, there tends to be. Um, Perhaps it's one that now is becoming less acute or not, because for me, it's very much about women's history and the voices of women still, certainly from the Tudor or earlier periods, still haven't got, even now with all the work that's happened in the last 10, 20 years, the same access as male voices have.
Mm,
So I started out with this book about Arbella Stewart, you know, who in her own day was expected to inherit Elizabeth I's throne and had this staggering life, but has been largely forgotten by history. And that was for two reasons. One is just that, you know, it's the winners who write history,
mm,
and it was her cousin, James I, who won the battle for the throne. But also, I think there was the question, this traditionally, you know, from, let's say, right up until quite late in the 20th century, this almost dismissal of women's history, women's voices. And that's really what, not consciously, but just instinctively, I
yeah.
wanted to address. I mean, even in a book like Elizabeth and Leicester, where there's two people in the title, one of them male, one of them female, but even then, the sort of the point applies because Elizabeth was kind of almost her feelings for Leicester and for her other favourites was almost used to denigrate her in a way. It was kind of, you know, considered as being her weak spot. Oh, well, guess what? She might be a great queen, but she was just a silly woman after all. You know, she had these crushes on these unsuitable men.
Mm,
And what I wanted to show was that for her, just as much as, you know, for the feminists of the 60s, the personal was political. She, for better or worse, used these men. They became an important part of her weaponry,
mm,
if
mm.
you like. And so really that was rather the Victorian perspective, guess what? She was this great icon, Gloriana, heroine of Tilbury, Virgin Queen and all that. But oh, she was pretty silly on the side,
And so
know?
yeah, no, and so that's what you set out to try and
Yeah,
address. And we
yes,
may
we
well come
do.
back to Elizabeth, because I know Elizabeth
Of
is
course,
one of your
always.
favourites.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll see how whether the chat takes us there.
Okay.
So is it Layla saying wonderful, excellent book on
Oh,
one of my favourite historical figures? That's your Arbella book. So
okay.
very nice.
And
So
Lola, I wonder if yes. Anyway, yeah, go on.
lovely. So now, of course, your book Game of Queens
Mm,
epitomizes, therefore, I guess, your
mm,
desire to give voice to female
yes,
stories. And you
yes.
captured in that book the stories of an incredible collection of women who were forces of nature in their
Mm,
time, I guess.
mm,
But
mm.
so I'm imagining several people who are joining us today will have read this, but for those people who haven't read your book, can you just give us a little précis of what it's about and what you were trying to do? I guess you might have answered some of that, but over to you, Sarah.
Well, no, in a way, let's if I can, it's a long answer, but
Yeah.
start with how it begun. It begun many, many years ago. One of the first books that got me hooked on Tudor history was Garrett Mattingly's great The Defeat of the Spanish Armada, a book from the first part of the 20th century, but still unbeatable in its way. And he just had a throwaway line about how odd it was that throughout most of the 16th century, the the religious conflict on either side had been spearheaded by a woman. And because he was thinking, of course, of Mary Stuart
Mm.
versus, if you like, Elizabeth Tudor. I thought, oh, yes, that's interesting. And I began looking. And what I found was both that it was truer than he'd said and went back further than he'd said, but that very often these were either physical mothers and daughters or mentors and proteges, that there were these lines of connection. I mean, it half killed me, a kind of family tree,
Ah.
the chains of lessons in power
Mm.
passing from one woman to another. And what interested me was that the women themselves were very conscious of these bonds. This isn't a kind of imposition from the Me Too generation.
Mm.
This was something of which they were absolutely aware.
Mm. And one of the points you make quite early on in your book, which I was like, yeah, of course, but it was really interesting nevertheless to have it pointed out so obviously, was that there was this real constellation of women
Mm,
at the heart of
mm,
power in Europe at the
mm.
time.
Yeah,
And I suppose one of my first questions was this novel, was this the first time in history where we have such
yeah.
an obvious kind of cluster of
Mm,
very powerful,
mm.
influential women?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Um, pr- hmm. I'm probably not equipped to answer about, for example, the ancient world. Okay. But
Mm.
in terms of the history that we all know, yes, I think probably it was. I mean, God knows there'd been powerful women before.
Mm.
Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example.
Mm.
And some of them, in fact, what I'm doing in the book I'm writing now is almost tracing links from them through to the Tudor age. But it was strange that the long 16th century, if you like, from an English
Mm.
perspective, 1485 to 1603, threw up this staggering number of women. I mean, you kind of kick off with Isabella of Castile, who we all know, and in France, people like Anne de Beaujeu, who many of us don't.
Mm.
And it is just extraordinary how fate kept on throwing up powerful women.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the time was maybe right to receive them, because there had been a lot of debate coming in with the Renaissance about women's roles, about women were really as incapable, you know, of holding power as had often been thought.
Mm.
And so really, I guess came the women.
And I guess you had that humanist, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah,
Kind of
yeah.
a right, the humanist sort of way of educating women,
Mm,
and
yeah.
humanists wanting to educate their daughters, etc.
Mm,
So yes, I see what you
mm,
mean about that. But what do you think was
mm.
the? We're going to dive into some of the stories of some of
Okay,
the women, maybe some of your
okay.
favourite stories,
Yeah,
some of the characters I
yeah,
most enjoy, and
yeah.
hopefully, folks, if you're watching this, maybe there are some of those women that you want to ask questions about. So we'll throw some names out there and then we'll explore from there. But
Mhm.
what do you think was the impact potentially of having this group of powerful women across the 16th century? Do you think it made a difference?
Mm. Well, I guess in lasting terms, what it almost meant was that no one could ever say, as certainly in England they had said before, that women really weren't capable of holding power. You know, after Elizabeth I, no one could ever
Mm.
say again that that was true. Um, I think, yeah, I think that was the big lesson. I mean, it's in Game of Queens, I realised I wound up, God help me, a book with 16 protagonists, 5 different territories, and covering,
Goodness.
you know, more than 100 years of history.
Mm.
So obviously the same answer doesn't quite apply across the board. But I think that kind of example of women successfully holding power and making alliances with each other is something that
Mm.
hasn't altogether been forgotten, but certainly shouldn't be forgotten. It went away for a bit. You know, I do see something
Yes.
as
Mm.
dying in Elizabeth's last years.
Mm.
Maybe, who knows, when she was forced to
Mm.
execute another powerful woman, you know, her
Mm.
cousin Mary
Mm.
of Fotheringay. But but once it's happened, it never goes away.
Yes, never forgotten, never
Mm,
completely forgotten.
mm,
So let's talk
yeah.
about some of the characters in the book.
Okay.
So, do you want to just give us a quick kind of um, outline of those 16 protagonists? And I don't mean
Oh
in
my
detail,
God.
just
Okay.
who were some of your
Oh,
favourite characters that you touched on, do
okay.
you think?
All right. Um, I should really have flashed up the family tree, except that no one will take it on board in a minute. Basically, I saw several different lines of power. I mean, some of which we know, as it were, but some we don't. So Isabella of Castile to her daughter Catherine of Aragon to her daughter Mary Tudor.
Mm.
We know about that.
Mm.
We know a little bit less of some of the lines in France. You know, there was Louise of Savoy, there was Jean d'Albret, Jean of Navarre, um, and and in England, of course, we all know about, you know, Anne Boleyn,
Yes.
Elizabeth I. But one of the characters who most fascinated me is one most of us in England certainly don't know, and we absolutely should do.
Mm.
Margaret of Austria. Now,
Ah.
oh yes, she kind of crosses a lot of boundaries. She was born the daughter of the ruling Duchess of Burgundy. She was at one point or another, she was, partly raised by Louise de Savoy in France. She was the daughter-in-law of Isabella of Castile. She came back to act as regent in the Netherlands for her nephew, Charles V, the
Mm.
Holy Roman Emperor. And while there, of course, you know, many young girls were sent to learn from her example, to be educated at her court, among them one Anne Boleyn.
Yes, indeed.
But she's there everywhere. She was there right through. She had helped raise Anne Boleyn, spoke very warmly of her, and yet when the time came for Henry VIII's great matter, for Catherine of Aragon to be seeking to try and defend her marriage, it was Margaret of Austria, her one-time sister-in-law, who found lawyers for her because Catherine said that no one in England dared really help her.
Ah, I see.
And yeah, and yet Margaret, I mean, her one-time father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon, wrote that, Margaret of Austria, she's the most powerful woman in Europe. She's the one on whom we all depend, that she is the only one who can sort out this great affair. And what particularly fascinated me was one particular incident, treaty, in 1529, the Treaty of Cambrai, which is better known as the Ladies' Peace,
Yeah.
because it was negotiated between two women, Margaret of Austria on behalf of her nephew, Charles V, and Louise of Savoy on behalf of her son, King Francois I of France. And it was totally about ending, or at least bringing a halt to, the endless wars between France and Spain. And the two women really did, you can see it in their letters, it's totally, the two young men, if they get together, they're just going to hook antlers, basically. If we can just get them out of the way, we two women can get the business done.
Is
As
that
in
how that
the
is that how that happened? Because I was fascinated
yeah,
by that.
totally. Yeah, yes.
It's,
Yeah,
I'm sort of almost gobsmacked about how they
I
managed
know,
to
well, I was too. Yeah.
maneuver these young men out of the way. How did
Well, I know. I mean, and Francois the First, Louise kind of packed him off to a hunting lodge a few miles away, so he spent the time killing things, which is, I guess, kind of what young early modern kings did, if in doubt, kill something. And Charles V kind of stayed a bit further off, but it totally was. These two women had known each other because Margaret of Austria had at one point been raised at the French court, so they
yes.
had briefly been young girls together. But it was absolutely about that, about their bond, their shared ability as women.
And so the outcome of that peace treaty, where did it happen? How long? Because they actually met in
Yeah.
person, right?
Oh, they absolutely met in person.
Yeah.
I mean, and Margaret, another one of to me, the most interesting characters, which is Marguerite of Navarre, came along, Louise of Savoy's daughter,
Yeah.
came along as well. So
Ah,
there were actually three powerful women there, with
ah.
all the men kind of, lurking somewhere in the background. I mean, Wolsey was lurking somewhere around, the various kings. But it literally, the politics of 16th century Europe being what they were, the peace didn't last that long, sad to say.
I was just going
But
to ask you about what the
no,
kind of
no,
outcome
I'm
was.
afraid not. But there
Mm.
are other examples. I mean, in Britain, you could see one. You could see one, sort of 20 years early or 15 years earlier, when Catherine of Aragon, in her husband Henry's absence, was organising the armies to go north and repel a potential Scottish invasion. And of course, her forces wound up killing the husband of her sister-in-law,
Mm.
Margaret Tudor.
Yeah, awkward family moment.
Well, quite, yes, quite. Yeah, how do you come round from that one for the next
Yeah,
Christmas party?
yeah.
Um, but, but again, there was that idea mooted, if only the two, by Margaret, if only the two women could get together, maybe they could sort things differently.
And I
And
suppose,
yeah,
go on, sorry.
after after the Battle of Flodden,
Mm,
disastrous loss of Scottish life and the Scottish king, Margaret Tudor's husband, killed.
mm,
Nonetheless, Catherine of Aragon was saying, well, wanted to send a priest north to comfort her sister-in-law. Now, you might think that's a little bit weird. First she sends the army that kills her brother, the man, and then she sends a priest to comfort the woman. But there may have been this idea that actually, if Margaret Tudor, as she had been, became regent of Scotland, she'd doubtless be running Scotland in a kind of, in English interests, in a sense.
mm.
Everything something in her background would incline her to an English alliance. And guess what? Peace is cheaper than war.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
that kind of amity, if she could have brought it off between the women, would
Mm.
actually have been an awfully lot cheaper and less bloodthirsty way of securing England's future.
And when you were saying about one of the women saying, "If only we could meet in person," of course, that
Yeah.
reminds me a little bit of Mary Queen of Scots and her
Well, indeed, yes. No, they were
ongoing.
all, yeah, that's right. Kind of after the personal meeting, the personal touch, if you like, for
Yeah.
better or worse.
Yes. I suppose when men met, they made war, and when women met, they tried to talk it out, maybe. Oh,
Well,
wonderful.
I think that's true, yeah.
Yeah. But you mentioned Margaret Tudor, and I hope you don't
Mm,
mind you
mm,
indulging me a little bit in Margaret Tudor, because she's a character who's come to my attention most recently. I've been doing some research about
mm,
locations in Scotland, mainly about
mhm,
Mary Queen of Scots, but you
mhm,
can't help tripping over Margaret Tudor
mm,
when you're sort of talking about
mm.
Linlithgow Palace and
Yeah,
Holyrood and so on and so
yeah,
forth. So, and I was, yeah, I mean, tell me about, can we talk a little bit
yeah,
about her life? Because she was just
yeah.
so young when she went to
Yeah,
Scotland.
absolutely. Margaret Tudor fascinates me in a completely different way from Margaret of Austria, because Margaret of Austria was, I mean, Margaret of Austria was, apart from anything else, you feel a staggeringly sensible woman
Yes.
and a likable one. If you had to be stuck on a desert island with any of the protagonists of Game of Queens, you'd go for Margaret Tudor every time.
That's
I mean, sorry,
yeah,
Margaret of
Margaret
Austria
of
every time.
Austria. Yeah.
One of the stories I like about Margaret of Austria is that when she was on the way by ship to Spain to to marry the son of Ferdinand and Isabella, the ship almost, dreadful storm, the ship almost went down in the Bay of Biscay. And Margaret of Austria, apparently, when everyone around her was terrified, composed this kind of rhyming jingle. You know, here lies Margaret, the willing bride, thrice married, but a virgin when she died. And any woman who can do that under those circumstances gets my vote.
Formidable.
Yeah. Margaret Tudor, a very different kettle of fish. As you say, she was very young, 13 when
Mhm.
she went to become queen.
Mhm.
Had her husband lived, doubtless her life pattern would have continued as that of a queen consort.
Mhm.
Since he died, with his heir still a young child, it fell to Margaret Tudor to try and grasp the reins of power. She didn't do it wholly successfully, but she was in this impossible position. And that one thing that interests me as the kind of predicament that very much epitomizes the downside, if you like, of being a 16th century female royal. Because if you think about it, after Flodden, the English army had massacred the Scottish nobility, killed the Scottish king. Now, here was Margaret. On the one hand, she was the mother of the new young Scottish king and the widow of the last one. On the other hand, she was the sister of the man whose armies had done the damage.
Mm.
And it was a huge, that conflict of interest. The Scottish nobles, when they looked at her, when they considered how much power she should have, how close to a regency, must have looked at her with this strange
Yeah.
double vision. What was she? The wife and mother of Scottish kings, or the sister of an English one? And Margaret herself had the same conflicts.
And
You know,
how did she, what evidence do we have as how she dealt with that and how
well,
she tried to
yeah, no,
reconcile that?
no, it was indeed a problem because, in a sense, the obvious person to whom she could turn would be her brother, Henry
Mm.
VIII. But yet, guess what? What his armies had just done. And he did, in a sense, she and her bids for power did, in a way, fall into the gap between those two things. But really, it's hardly surprising.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And one thing that
No,
interests
go
me in terms of what you were saying,
mm,
because I know your particular interest is in places and so on, just to what degree Margaret Tudor's story actually foreshadows that of Mary, Queen of Scots. I mean, at one point, you have Margaret Tudor pregnant, heavily pregnant, making this wild ride to try and escape from her enemies among the
mm,
Scottish nobles. Guess what? Decades later, you've got Mary, Queen of
yeah,
Scots doing exactly the
the
same
same
thing.
thing.
Mm.
As somebody's just said, Lane has just said the Scottish nobles were a tough bunch. They
Yeah,
were, weren't they?
they sure were. No, it's one of the great questions. If you're looking at late or mid 16th century queenship, certainly in the British Isles,
Mm,
is why Elizabeth Tudor made it work, Mary Stuart didn't. And a part of that undoubtedly is down to personality and
mm,
also training. But a part of it, which we probably, I know I do, we tend to underestimate,
yeah,
is that thing of the Scottish nobles.
yeah,
Just, what a different position the crown
yeah.
there was in.
Yes, when I was in Scotland and I met several people from the Mary Stuart Society who were telling me
Oh,
about the fact that, Elizabeth had the likes of Cecil who were for
exactly.
England, and there wasn't the same kind of sense of unity around the Scottish nobles being
No,
for Scotland. They were more for themselves.
no, she had one. Mary Stuart had one great servant, I think, in Maitland,
Ah,
who,
yes.
yes, who to me is kind of the Scottish Cecil, and a fascinating character. But no, indeed, she did have impossible problems to cope with.
A couple of people have just been talking. I've just been keeping an eye on chat as we've been going through. There's been lots and lots of comments. So thank you guys for sort of keeping chatting and commenting, and lots of people saying, they love you and could listen to you talk all day, and they love your necklace as well, by the way. So good
Thank
fashion
you.
choice. But I've seen a couple of people talk about Cecily Neville. Have you
Mm.
done any research on Cecily Neville, just saying
Well,
how much
yeah,
they
well,
admire her and what a powerful woman she is?
yes, interesting. Blood sisters, of course, the women behind the Wars of the Roses. She was very much one of them. Yes, fascinating character. Uh, I'm fascinated at once by what we know and what we don't know,
Okay.
because, I mean, it's perhaps I should just say briefly who she
Yes,
was.
please do.
Um,
Yes.
Cecily, she was the mother of Edward IV, and therefore also of Duke of Clarence and of Richard III. So Cecily Neville, she was a great, pre-Tudor, late medieval matriarch. She was, sort of the matriarch of the Yorkist line. But although we have things like letters Cecily Neville wrote, to sort of her steward of her lands, or to, um, tenants she felt had done her wrong, saying they should cease, on peril of her great displeasure and heavy ladyship. We don't know some of the most fundamental things about her. We know her daily routine, even in later life, how early she got up in the morning and how many religious services she heard. But she had to stand by as one of her sons, Edward IV, ordered the execution of another, the Duke of Clarence. She had to stand by while one of her sons, Richard III, deposed, if no worse, her grandson, the boy who would have been Edward V.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, we don't know what she thought about it.
No record.
There are some reports.
Mm.
There's some evidence on the Richard III thing from which you can extrapolate, but basically, it's almost, if you could go back in time and have a serious conversation with one woman,
Mm.
she would be the one.
Really, that's interesting because, as I say, I know your heroine is Elizabeth I, but clearly that
Yeah,
conundrum. Wow,
yeah.
yes.
I mean, the personally fascinating one for me, probably for most of us, is Anne Boleyn. But Cecily Neville, when you think about it, there are some very extraordinary questions there.
Yeah, amazing. So I'd love to carry on, but I'm also mindful of chat. And somebody, if we could just sort of cycle back to
Yeah.
Mary Queen of Scots, I believe we're talking Susan Sackett saying, what about the Catholic Protestant issue for Mary? So how did that play into her
Mm,
queenship?
yes. Yeah. No, that was an absolutely major problem. One, of course, for which Elizabeth I had to deal with it to some degree, but not quite in the same way. The trouble, Mary Stuart, from the start of her active queenship, was effectively on the other side of the fence from that of many of the men who might have been her support,
Mm,
from many of her nobles. And that was a really fundamental issue of her queenship. After her active queenship, after she fled south into England, of course, it dominated her identity to an even greater degree. I mean, on the one hand, Mary's Catholicism represented the huge problem for Elizabeth, that to true Catholics, Mary, not Elizabeth, was the rightful Queen of England. And on the other, it became increasingly, as the years of her captivity wore on, the linchpin of Mary's own identity. Certainly, she went to her death effectively recasting herself as a Catholic martyr.
yeah, I mean, obviously, my understanding of Mary is obviously she was always deeply Catholic, but she was quite tolerant
Yeah,
of
yeah, she
Protestants.
was.
but
Yeah.
but she kind of got forced into this Catholic when she came
Yeah.
to England, as you say, and it was a great identity that's given her a sense of immortality, really,
No, I
hasn't it?
think that's exactly right. I mean, we know that famous scene at Fotheringay, when
Yeah.
she's taking off her overdress to reveal an underskirt, in the crimson, the colour of Catholic martyrdom.
Mm.
Yes, I think that's it. That what became that, rather than failed queen who'd made some really rotten marital choices, became the identity that would take her forward into posterity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's another lady being mentioned. I don't know whether you've studied this lady, Anne of Cleves. So somebody said, I've almost been
Oh,
impressed with Anne of Cleves. Now,
okay.
she is another
Yeah.
interesting character, isn't
Well,
she?
it is, I know, and one who's probably had an unfair deal in history, posterity, memory, whatever, in that we all think, oh, the Flanders mare. And as we now know, that was very possibly not true.
Mm.
It was more about Henry. But again, I know I love Anne of Cleves. We all, so you would do too if you love Hever. But we all really want to know. We'd love to think that after her marriage with Henry was dissolved, after she went off as the king's quote dear sister, we'd love to think that she had a sort of really happy life as a single woman. In some ways perhaps she did, but unfortunately the evidence does suggest she never ceased to mourn her queenship,
Yeah, yeah.
feel that she had been cheated of the role in life she should have had.
It's interesting because you were talking earlier about if you were stranded on a desert island and you wanted to be
Mm.
with somebody. I think kind of Cleves might be that person for me
Actually, you're right. No, she'd be pretty good, I'm sure. I
because
think you're right.
she came across to me as being such a warm-hearted,
Yeah.
kind, sort
Yes.
of person you'd
Yeah.
really want as a dependable
Oh,
friend.
oh, yeah, I can totally second that one. Yeah.
Okay, right. Let's have a look. So somebody's saying the smartest wife. So I imagine that's related to Anne of
Yes.
Cleves. Did Anne of Cleves attend? I think the Virgin Queen's coronation. So we're talking about Elizabeth. She was dead.
Ah,
Just trying.
did. She was around for a number of the big ceremonies
Yeah.
for the two women who'd been briefly her stepdaughter, for Mary, and but she was Anne of Cleves was effectively passing out of public life
Yes.
to a great degree.
Yeah. And I think
Well,
she
she
died in
died. Yeah,
1557.
she
I
died.
think. So
Yeah. By the time Elizabeth actually came to the throne, yes, indeed.
yeah,
She was around a little bit during Mary's reign, but effectively she seems to have kept her head down.
yeah,
Very understandably, one feels, because even after her divorce, if that's the word, the annulment of her marriage to Henry, she kept on having to be worried, basically. There'd be investigations into her religious beliefs, into who she'd been having contact with.
yes,
So I think she learned to just, yeah.
yeah. And so we've got somebody else, Analia, was saying, in your point of view, what was the worst mistake that Mary, Queen of Scots, took that
Oh
kind of resulted in her fall?
God, where do you start? Um,
There's a few.
well, Darnley, Bothwell. The mistakes seem to be kind of the men, basically.
Mm,
Um, it's, I think it does come down to the men, really.
mm, mm,
Uh, Darnley, one can see why she did it, and in a sense, Elizabeth almost forced her into it because, the constant pressure that Elizabeth was placing on her not to marry without Elizabeth's sanction, that frankly insulting idea that Mary should marry Robert Dudley,
mm,
Elizabeth's
mm,
own favourite. But
mm.
Darnley did turn out to be a disastrously bad choice. And then, of course, after Darnley's murder, what does Mary do but turn around and quickly allow herself to be persuaded or coerced into marriage with the man many thought had killed her had
Yeah.
killed her family. You can't beat that one, really, can you?
No.
I mean, I don't think any of us now really think that the casket letters were right. It's fairly widely accepted that they were either completely forged or doctored. So, a lot of the calumnies against her we can now deny. But the charge of having made rotten choices. And of course, a third rotten choice proved to be coming south over the
Yeah.
border to England. But
Yeah.
it does, perhaps then she felt she didn't have many choices, but it did seem as though consistently Mary had a very unrealistic view of her position. I mean, in England, she didn't appear to appreciate quite what an appalling problem she posed for Elizabeth.
Mm,
Um, God knows she paid for it, but somehow it's impossible not to feel that whether it was through personality or through training, because of course she'd grown up in France, she was reared as the decorative queen consort to a French king rather than as the active Queen of Scotland.
yeah.
She
Yeah.
just wasn't there for the job.
Somebody also made a point to me when I was up in Scotland recently that Elizabeth was, from being a child, from being a small child, she had to deal with what happened to her
Yeah,
mother and
yeah.
all the politics that were swirling around her. She had such a good schooling, didn't she?
Yeah,
And
that's right. I mean, a
you know,
brutal
hand,
schooling, but you could hardly get a better one
yeah.
in all those difficult, edgy arts.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
So I think we should talk about Elizabeth. So I think because I know she's your
Always a
favourite. So
pleasure.
hold on a minute. We've just had a couple of let me just ask you a couple of questions. I was going to dive into one of my own, but we've got a couple come through here. So okay. So Beverly's saying, how do you feel when you see these women you admire portrayed on screen? That's a really
Oh,
interesting.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, actually, let's take Elizabeth because I almost don't care how they portray Mary. Sorry. Um, I think we've all got our favourites, haven't we? I mean, to me, I suppose I grew up on Glenda Jackson, and I'm not sure that she can ever be beaten. Um, how do I feel in general? I guess it does depend how you feel about the portrayal.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
the Glenda Jackson quite politically oriented portrayal probably helped shape many of our ideas of Elizabeth, and not necessarily in a bad way. I'm not sure there's much there that I disagree with,
Mm.
even now. Um, no, I think it does all depend how well it's done. I mean, I personally, sorry, we're getting here into the big issue of fact and fiction. I personally am quite tolerant of small deviations from the known facts. Maybe that's my background as a film journalist. With the Tudors, I can forgive. I've had conversations with Alison Weir where she was very cross about the wrong shape of head bonnet. Well, forgive me, I possibly wouldn't have recognised, but I can certainly forgive that.
Mm.
I can even sort of forgive them for taking two of Henry VIII's sisters, melding them together and marrying them to the wrong king. But the bit that that did it for me with the Tudors, and I've had conversations with Michael Hirst, the man who wrote it,
All
but
right.
where Cromwell
Yeah.
took a number of palace grandees down to the cellar in Whitehall or wherever and showed them this amazing new gadget that was going to get the word out about Anne Boleyn and the dissolution of the monasteries. And they all went, oh, good heavens, invention of the devil. And it was the printing press.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're about half a century out.
Yeah.
So that's the one that lost it for me. I'm sorry, that's a very rambling answer. But in a sense, yeah, I guess seeing these women portrayed on screen, it comes down for me to whether the portrayal is one I recognise, if you like.
Mm, mm. And I'm gonna maybe in some ways this next question is related a little bit, but James is asking your opinion. Who would you say are the most unfairly maligned women in both the 15th and 16th century? So again, this
Oh,
is kind of how we've
sure.
interpreted
Well,
people.
oh, that's interesting. Well, of course, everyone in a sense wound up maligned by one side and lauded by the other.
Yeah, that's true.
Actually, I think Margaret of Anjou is one I'd go for. 15th century, the
Yeah.
wife of Henry VI, the second woman to be dubbed the she-wolf of second English queen to be dubbed she-wolf of France. Called this great and strong laboured woman. But of course, by then we were into the Wars of the Roses. So if you were on the Lancastrian side, she'd be a wholly good thing. If you were on the Yorkist side, she'd be an appalling one.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a bit of general sexism from both sides going on, but I think she's someone who's had a pretty bad press. I don't feel she was remotely an easy character, but in a sense, events forced her to the
Yeah.
line she took.
Right. And somebody else, Layla again, I think it's Layla. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrongly, saying Arbella. So obviously you
Oh,
spent a lot of time
oh
writing
well,
about her.
now that's interesting. Yes, actually, I guess in a way it depends what you call maligned, because in a way, Arbella's problem was more being forgotten or dismissed over the centuries rather than actively maligned. Um,
Mm,
okay,
okay.
Arbella, who in fact possibly even she's still my favourite heroine as in person to write about.
All right.
I don't hold the brief that I do for Elizabeth. I hate to say it, but had she become queen, she'd probably have been a rotten one. Because again, like Mary Queen of Scots, she hadn't had the training for it. But Arbella, she had this extraordinary life, reared by her grandmother Bess of Hardwick in the hope, expectation that she might inherit Elizabeth's throne. And because, her father was Lord Darnley's younger brother, descended
Mm,
from
mm,
Margaret Tudor. Um, and many contemporaries actually thought that would happen. There was a moment in the 1580s when all the ambassadors were writing it is Arbella, 1590s even, they would proclaim queen if Elizabeth were now to die. But over the years, Arbella's chances faded away. She tried in the first months of 1603, as Elizabeth was dying, Arbella, 27 and still a spinster, which of course was, unusual for an aristocrat of the day, tried to arrange her own marriage. Now, she did so with a boy she'd never met, but one who had his own claim to the throne, a Seymour, so descended from the sister of Lady Jane Grey.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow, and then later on she came to James's court, she made an unsanctioned marriage with the brother of the one she'd gone through for the first time. Oh, it was discovered, they're imprisoned in the Tower, Arbella fled abroad. It's all good dramatic stuff. But over the years, Arbella has been cast as entirely a victim of other people's ambitions. And, one who only wanted a sort of quiet life with a, man she loved. I don't quite see how you can make the events of 1603 work out that way.
Right.
She was gunning for the throne, as she had been raised to do. So she's been, not blamed, if you like, but almost more dismissed by the perceptions of later centuries.
Yeah, interesting.
Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No,
but
not at all. Not at all. No, I think it's quite an important distinction, isn't it? There is definitely a distinction between being dismissed and maligned. I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions, and I absolutely know what the last one's going to be, and that's what you're working on next. But I think we've got a chance to squeeze one in from Silkworm and Cottontails, who I know, and who's a hello there, nice to see you. She is saying, how do you think Elizabeth really felt about her father putting her mother to death? She couldn't publicly slur her father's memory, but it must have been difficult to forgive him.
Well, it must, but Elizabeth in adulthood, I mean, we do not know how or by who Elizabeth was told about her mother's fate. So she grew up without her mother there, with her father as a very important, sometimes inimical, but massively important presence. In later life, as a queen, there were a few little but significant signals that she revered her mother's memory. Jewels, a ring with her mother's image in it, the way that she did promote some of her mother's relations. But she didn't do, when she came to the throne, Elizabeth did not do what Mary did, which is to have her mother's, her mother's reputation officially cleared up. Elizabeth needed to do what she did, which is to proclaim herself as Henry's daughter, because it was on that her claim to the throne rested, obviously. So she was either too wise or too wary to make too much fuss about Anne Boleyn. The pageantry, when she was crowned, the pageantry did feature Anne Boleyn, as a heroine. And of course, Anne Boleyn was a heroine for Elizabeth, politically as well as personally, in one sense, in that Elizabeth's claim to the throne, her legitimacy, rested on the Protestant religion. But all the same, Elizabeth, I mean, who knows? It would be possible, perhaps, for a psychiatrist to see this as a kind of abuse syndrome almost, but Elizabeth grew up in the shadow of her father, and that is the image, the echo that she evoked more consciously.
Yeah, you can't repudiate your father if you're then aligning your whole premise for being on the throne through your father. It would be
exactly that.
So contradictory.
Exactly that. Yeah. There is evidence that she and those around her obviously did want, up to a point, to honour her mother's memory, but that was done pretty discreetly.
Yeah, in privately, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are really coming to the end of our hour. How fast it always flies round. I hope you guys have been enjoying the chat so far. Sarah, you've been amazing. And I definitely want to ask you, somebody was saying, Linda was saying, Sarah, you hinted about a book you're writing.
Oh,
Anything you can share for us to look forward
well,
to?
yeah, absolutely. Basically, you're my test group because I care passionately about this book, but because it's a complex one, I've got to work out exactly how I can explain it to people in one sentence. It's called The Tudors in Love, and it is about how romance really shaped this particular dynasty. They were a dynasty in love with the idea of love. I mean, not just Henry VIII and his marriages, his sisters, Elizabeth's great play on the idea of herself as adored and beloved. But behind that, like every good iceberg, it's got a hidden submerged tenth. And those tenths are this romantic ideal that had dominated aristocratic Europe for centuries when the Tudors came along, the idea of courtly love. It
Lovely.
was an idea C.S. Lewis, great medievalist as well as the man who gave us Narnia, said that courtly love was an idea compared to which the Renaissance was just a ripple on the surface of literature.
Brilliant.
I'd say, and it's true in a way, and I'd say it's an idea that's still with us today. So through the prism of the Tudors, I wanted to explore that too. So it's The Tudors in Love. It's out next autumn, the begin September the 1st, I think.
Oh,
But
brilliant.
behind that, there's another story.
Oh, excellent. Good. Well, hopefully that's got everybody's taste buds whetted and looking forward to your next book. Wonderful. So, so I just want to say thank you, Sarah, so much for being part of Tudor Talk. As I say, the time has flown by and we've had so many comments. So just let me read a few to you here. So Sue saying, really, time really does fly. This is fascinating. Lane says, this has been just terrific. Beverly says, thank you, lovely Sarahs.
Oh,
And Linda Williams, miss you, Sarah. Good to
oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so Linda was asking a question before, so I didn't say the surname, but obviously you guys know each other. Jane, fascinating chat. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It's amazing. Both Sarah's rock. Layla is saying, can't wait to read your book. And Jamie, wow, I'm looking forward to that book. Thank you so much for the chat. Oh gosh, they're just piling in. So that's wonderful. And if you want to
Thank you.
and Sarah, you will be able to see, hopefully, the live chat. It's a bit temperamental, but it does tend to at some point appear. So if you want to go and check out all the nice comments afterwards, I'm sure you can
Thank
do
you.
so. So I'm going to say goodbye now, but guys, if you could just stay on, I've got a couple of just announcements as ever. Oh, you might not be able to, hopefully you can hear me again now. I just was on mute for a moment. Okay, so I just wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I am holding a virtual summit at the end of this month, The Rise and Fall of Cardinal Wolsey. Some of you are probably aware that it's the 490th anniversary of the death of Cardinal Wolsey on the 29th of November. And I've been working over the last few months to put together a virtual mini summit. And I have Professor Glenn Richardson, Professor Catherine Fletcher, and Dr. Jonathan Foyle, and myself, covering all sorts of aspects of Wolsey's life, from his early years, his rise, his involvement in the King's Great Matter, his patronage of the arts and Hampton Court, his death, of course, his downfall, and I'll be covering his final journey from Cawood through to Leicester Abbey by looking at the places which he stayed in and how that story unfolded. So if you want to register, it is entirely free to participate. The videos will go live over the weekend of the 28th to the 29th of November. But if you're registered, you do not have to watch them live. They will be available for you to watch right the way through to the 5th of January. So when you've had enough of that Christmas turkey and you want to escape the rallies and you just need some you time with some Tudor stuff, you can go back, watch the videos, or catch up at the videos on your leisure. So if you want to register, it's it's the usual, the tudortravelguide.com/virtual summit, and you'll see the link. I've put the link in the description below. So if you click on that, you'll be taken through to the page where you'll have more info and you can reserve your place. As I said, it's completely free. And the final announcement I want to make is it's Christmas. Oh gosh, sorry about that, guys, if I said the C word. But planning ahead at this time of year, I always make a limited number of my books, signed books, available. So if you want to purchase signed copies of either of my In the Footsteps books, that's In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn, In the Footsteps of the Six Wives of Henry VIII, or my novel, Le Temps Viendra, a novel of Anne Boleyn, which is in English, in 2 volumes. I have 10 copies of each to be signed for Christmas gifts. And if you're interested, all you need to do is send me an email at sarah@thetudortravelguide.com. That's sarah@thetudortravelguide.com. Tell me your name, where you live in the world, and which book you're interested in, and I'll be able to get back to you with the costs associated with that, and then we can take it from there if you're interested. And of course, I'd need to know whether it's a present for you or somebody else, and how you'd like me to sign the book. So yes, so those are a couple of things, and with that, I just want to end and say thank you so much. There have been over 90 of you joining us this evening. It's been wonderful. It's really made by having you here, and your interaction is so much fun. So thank you. And once again, just to say, December, there's no live chat in December. I take a bit of downtime in December to do some planning in the background for the Tudor Travel Guide in the year ahead. There's going to be loads going on. But we will be back in January, and I'm talking to Michael Carter, who's a specialist on the dissolution of the monasteries and works with English heritage, and he is a fantastic character. So that will be, I will advertise, I don't know whether it's the first Saturday, I think it might be the second Saturday in January, but if you stick around on social media, of course, you'll see me posting. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. All right, lots of love. Bye.